Hi, everybody. This is Rob Doggett from the International Yeats Society and from the State University of New York at Geneseo. We're doing another installment of Yeats Conversations, and today I'm here with Jack Quinn. Hey, Jack, how you doing?
Hi Rob, good to see you. All
Yeah, it's
good.
a pleasure to see you. We saw each other this summer at the Yates Summer School and had a lot of fun there. And I was really glad we had this chance to chat. I don't know if I mentioned it to you when I was in Sligo, but I read your book in the late spring, and it's Yeats and the Language of Sculpture. I'm sure a lot of people know it. It came up with Oxford University Press in 2022. Um, it's a terrific book and really essential reading for people studying Yeats. So I enjoyed it quite a bit. So it's such a pleasure to talk with you. And we're going to talk today about a poem that's right in your bailiwick here, the statues, and a complicated poem. So it's great to have you here to talk about it. But so you are assistant professor at Dublin City University, and I mentioned your book. What's your current research that you're doing?
Thank you so much, Rob. Yeah, well, currently I'm still looking a bit at Yeats, partly inspired by the Yeats Summer School that I really enjoyed attending in July there. I've been writing a bit about Yeats and Atavarima and those eight-line stanza poems by Yeats. And more broadly, I'm thinking more about sculpture in modernist poetry and trying to think about book number two now that the Yeats stuff is out of the way.
All right. Well, you gotta keep going. Well, that would be great. I think a book on modernism sculpture would be really welcome. So that sounds terrific. Um, so when we talked over the summer and you mentioned the statues, and I mean it makes sense given your research, but do you have any sort of particular affinities with that poem? It's one that I only teach it when I do a full seminar on Yeats. So I feel like you have to have kind of read Yeats all semester to have any kind of purchase on that thing, and students have trouble with it. So what was your interest in the poem? Why'd you pick this one?
Yeah, that's a very fair summary, I think, of the poem. It is one that challenges readers. I very rarely set it for teaching because I think it's such a compression of Yeats's lifelong ideas, and particularly his ideas in the 1930s around politics and aesthetics. And um, uh, to be honest, I chose it because I think these conversations are so good at teasing out some of the difficulties in those Yeats poems. And it's one that I keep coming back to because it's about sculpture and seems to be a lifelong summation of sculptural interest by Yeats. And yet it's one that every time I come back to it, I see more in it, and there's more to sort of tease apart from the ambiguity of it.
Yeah, I feel that too. I go into it sometimes teaching it with my students, and I think, okay, I've got a handle on where I'm going to go with this, and I start reading some lines and I'm always like, wait, that doesn't exactly fit what I thought I understood about the poem. And there are so many roads to go down with it. When I first was teaching it, I tended to be more focused on the political elements and the sort of there's the eugenics ideas running in the background that maybe we'll talk a little bit about. But lately, I've been more fascinated by just material culture and the aesthetic side of things. So this will be fun to talk about. So let's have you read the poem if you don't mind, and I will share my screen. Here we go. Let's see if I pull this off. Okay, you see that?
Yeah,
Okay, and
yeah, absolutely.
I'll move down as we go along. This will be a smooth operation here.
Great. The statues. Pythagoras planned it. Why did the people stare? His numbers, though they moved or seemed to move in marble or in bronze, lacked character. But boys and girls, peeled from the imagined love of solitary beds, knew what they were. That passion could bring character enough, and pressed at midnight in some public place, live lips upon a plummet measured face. No, greater than Pythagoras, for the men that with a mallet or a chisel modelled these calculations that look but casual flesh, cut down all Asiatic vague immensities, and not the banks of oars that swam upon the many-headed foam at Salamis. Europe put off that foam when Phidias gave women dreams and dreams their looking glass. One image crossed the many-headed, sat under the tropic shade, grew round and slow. No Hamlet thin from eating flies, a fat dreamer of the Middle Ages. empty eyeballs knew that knowledge increases unreality, that mirror on mirror mirrored is all the show. When Gong and Conch declare the hour to bless, Grimalkin crawls to Buddha's emptiness. When Pierce summoned Cuchulainn to his side, what stalked through the post office? What intellect, what calculation, number, measurement replied? We Irish, born into that ancient sect, but thrown upon this filthy modern tide, and by its formless spawning fury wrecked, climb to our proper dark that we may trace the lineaments of a plummet measured face.
All right, thanks. That's nice. And sorry about the chimes that are popping in there. I should have turned that off, and I'm not sure how to do it. Anyway, we'll work through it. So the start of this poem, you do my usual thing. Okay, Pythagoras. My students inevitably talk about ratios and golden ratios. So there seems to be this idea of a kind of mathematical uh, abstraction in the backdrop that well, that opening question, I mean, there's sort of some kind of mathematical ratio behind the statues or informing the statues. And then this question, like, why did people stare at it? So maybe we could start with that opening question there.
Yeah, it's a poem that's filled with rhetorical questions, and that even that first one begins from this point of ambiguity. You know, Pythagoras planned it. What is it? Why did the people stare? Yeah, Yet sort of he teases out the fact that this is about sculptures. And you're absolutely right. I think there's a hint of the mathematical golden ratio and the way by which perhaps classical Greek sculpture became more anatomically exact through proportions and measurement that pops up time and again.
Hmm.
But many of these questions, I think, force us to read on to even make sense of what the subject matter is here
Hmm.
beyond the title.
Hmm. And we have this idea then of lacking character. And does that suggest then there's something in the ratio that might there's the absence of that kind of physicality to it. Is that the idea here, or something approaching more realism, so abstraction versus more kind of realistic sculpture?
Yeah, I always get the impression that it's sort of playing off sort of this formulaic, sort of cold precision of numbers versus personality and the human, and that word character, which pops up a few times in the poem, seems to
Hmm.
be about seeing something familiar in a statue of a person or a sculpture of a human.
Hmm.
It's worth noting as well that one of the draft titles for the poem was Pythagorean numbers.
Huh.
So Yeats played around with this idea, I think, of that more abstract, the point of the golden ratio,
Hmm.
which really only appears in the beginning or in the first two stanzas of the poem, as it
Hmm.
then moves into these specific statues afterwards. But I think that word character as well is playing with the individual figures and what perhaps humans can identify and relate to in a sculpture when they see it. There's also, I mentioned that ambiguity of the opening question and what is the it that Pythagoras planned. I think even those second and third lines are kind of wavering between they moved or seemed to move in
Hmm.
marble or in bronze. It's kind of weighing up different possibilities here.
Yeah, so this idea of how the relationship between the individual and the experience of sculpture versus more abstract notions about how we think about sculpture more generally, and that ambiguity built in there, I think makes sense of moving or seems to move. And then the next part, then we get, but boys and girls pale from the imagined love to solitary breads knew what they were. And that's really interesting. Again, this ambiguity there, as if there's an understanding that these people have, these boys and girls, that is not has gone unnamed in the poem. What is the thing that they what is the thing that they seem to know?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Again, I think it's the ambiguity. What knew what they were. It implies the boys and girls of that line know better than we do. Certainly, as we're reading it. Um, I think this connects in some ways to broader ideas that Yeats has about art having the ideal forms of beauty um, that inform what humans then, what living people. set as the standards of beauty. He has a similar idea in another poem from the last poems, Long-Legged Fly, in which he
Hmm.
talks about girls who find the first atom in their thought, and the atom is Michelangelo's atom.
Hmm.
Uh, I think here that idea of boys and girls peel from the imagined love of solitary beds. There's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek element to it, but it is this idea that they're imagining and fantasizing about the ideal form, perhaps in statues rather than in fellow people,
Hmm.
and that idea of character that's presented before that then returns a few lines later, that passion could bring character enough. It's a sort of passionate and slightly strange congress between living persons and statues here. This affection for the bodily forms that comes to the end of that stanza and is hinting at this idea that uh, character is something to do with perhaps a more amorous passion.
Hmm. So a kind of, I mean, we always get these antinomies, of course, in Yeats, and so it seems as if there's an abstract. I keep returning this idea of some kind of abstract notion of a form, of an aesthetic form, and then there is the human sort of passion and vitality, and that the linking between the two produces something closer to character, right? That idea of character, is that right?
Yeah, and I think there's something of the Pygmalion myth here as well, I
Oh yeah.
think. I think that idea of, the perfect statue created by Pygmalion, of a woman in marble that eventually comes to life because it's so perfect, but also uh, the early parts of that myth in which Pygmalion desires the statue to come to life and it uh, remains cold and inanimate. I think it's playing with that. Certainly, those last two lines, where these boys and girls peel from the imagined love, etc., pressed at midnight in some public place, live lips upon a plummet measured face. It's this idea of literally kissing a statue in a public square that he's playing with.
We shift into this the next stanza here with this assertive no, the exclamation point at my students. This is always one of those moments where they're sort of following along, and I do the kind of antinomies business at the outset, the sort of abstract and the physical and a uniting of the two. And I really like what you're saying about the Pygmalion myth, which I think I need to bring back in there, and the sort of desire here. And so the students seem to be following a little bit, and then all of a sudden we get this no. As if is it suggesting that what he's indicated before is somehow wrong, or what's the transition here? And what's the idea of greater than Pythagoras here? So it seems to be that we're moving through in a kind of history of sculpture, I guess a sort of idealized notion of sculpture going from mathematical ratios into something else, into a new form. So maybe we could take us through what's going on in this transition here in the second stanza.
Yeah, I do love that exclamatory no. I think this is the Yeats that has a bit of a sense of humor, even as he's philosophizing about aesthetics and politics. And I think this kind of connects to the form of the poem. It's an ottava rima, as probably worth just mentioning what that is. It's an eight-line stanza, uh, generally with an A B A B A B rhyme scheme followed by a C C rhyming couplet at the end. And we get that fairly consistently through this poem, even if some of those rhymes are I rhymes or half rhymes. But it's a form that goes, for Yeats, he's drawing quite a lot on Byron and Shelley, the Romantic poets. And Helen Vendler has written really well about this being a stanza form that is mock heroic, and Yeats takes it back to the heroic. I think we certainly get elements of that in the statues, but it's also one that for Byron is a bit playful. It allows him to interrupt himself in Don Ewan and in Beppo and his sort of long form Ottava poems where there's a bit of humor between the six lines and the two-line couplets. There's an opportunity at the break from one couplet into the next interlocking rhyme to sort of correct himself or to reject what's said before. I think here Yeats is doing something like that. He's almost revising his own opinion about what Pythagoras did to inform sculpture here. He's taking it beyond that into again, the idea of sculpture as being almost precisely the human, that in the Pygmalion myth we have the statue that is so realistic that it becomes the human it represents. And here in that second stanza, greater than Pythagoras, the men with mallet or chisel modeled these calculations that look but casual flesh. I think even the language that Yeats is using, that alliterative quality of calculations and casual, and also the consonants there, is kind of blurring from the numbers and the abstract and the cold mathematics into the bodily and the desired casual flesh
Hmm.
beneath the marble.
I love that. And I had not thought at all about the possibility of humor in this poem, but as soon as you were talking about the Atava Rima, and you think about Atava Rima, and this is something again with the students. As soon as we encounter a poem, I'll ask about form, and if it's an Intava Rima, they all know that Helen Vendler sort of side of things. Which this is Yeats in his sort of high mode. This is Yeats in he uses that form for his big philosophical meditations, his big topics, and so we tend to treat this very seriously, and I think forget that Byronic element of the mock heroic. And I think you're right. As you were talking, I just saw it in the transition from the six to the eight in the first stanza. There's a way in which you get caught up in all this philosophy, but then the silliness of it, and there is an element of like casual silliness in it of going out in public and kissing the kissing the statues, and there is a kind of I like what you're saying about calculation and casual flesh. There's a bit of an undermining of some of the high seriousness in here that makes sense to me. With high seriousness, I think associated with a kind of mathematical precision that is always pushing into a kind of dead abstraction and a more sense of statues as having a kind of living quality and a tangible quality and an absence of the kind of permanence that, and you talk a bit about this in your book, the absence of the kind of permanence that sometimes people associate with sculpture and thinking, oh, we're setting this down for all time, and here embracing the sort of side of the statue as interactive and decaying and in time and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think um, with so many of Yeats's poems about sculpture, I think the shadow of Shelley's Ozymandias, not an Atavarima poem, but a sonnet, is there that idea of statues that move or seem to move,
Hmm.
calculations that look but casual flesh is also connected to that idea of it being more dynamic, non-static, perhaps even subject to aging, just as it is something that can be desired and is not merely the cold, solid object.
Hmm. 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 And then, yeah, that's great. And then we get, of course, into the Asiatic vague immensities. So one of the more famous lines in here, kind of notorious line, and Foster is kind of critical here, and lots of other critics are. We get smacks of Orientalism and that sort of thing. What do you make of this change here, and maybe thinking about it in the context of Yeats's understanding about various art forms from the East?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that's well said. I think this is where the more difficult elements of the poem are, and this is also partly why it's a difficult poem to teach, because certainly in the second stanza and into the third, we get either a naive or a quite dim view of the East taken as a catch-all. Roy Foster in his biography does talk about how the eugenicism, but also the xenophobia and the anti-democratic sentiments are just beneath the surface in this poem. And I think
Hmm.
it's perhaps the triumph of the form and the language that it can almost occlude that. And I think for students in first reading as well, perhaps they miss the more difficult and problematic elements that yeah really begin there with the Asiatic vague immensities. In some ways, I read this as a dim view of Eastern sculpture by Yeats, but it then moves into this uh, the Battle of Salamis between between the Greeks and the Persians. I think it was
Can you
480
just say
BC.
more real quickly, Jack, about the sort of dim view of Eastern sculptural forms that you mentioned a second ago?
Well, I think he's talking about a movement from uh, the Greek sculpture that the first stanza and a half has into this idea of uh, a more abstract,
Okay.
ancient sculpture in the East. But he's
Hmm.
also, through the Battle of Salamis, he's bringing in a bit of history and the idea that Greco-Buddhist sculpture emerges after Alexander the Great, and sort of this bringing in of Greek sculptural technique and aesthetics to India. And but yet, say, it's quite a patchy and patchwork history that he's providing, and one that I think does kind of restrict that view of the East to one of simply barbarism for Yeats.
Hmm.
And yet he's playing with this idea of some sort of cultural exchange or fusion between the elements that are admired at the beginning of the poem, from Pythagoras right through the classical Greek sculpture, into this movement into Indo and Indo-European sculpture in the second and third stanzas.
Hmm. Can you mention just gloss on Salamis for folks who don't know about that?
Yeah, well, it's a naval battle as far as I'm aware, between the Greeks and the Persians that results in it's a victory for the Greeks, and is traced by some, including Yeats, in a vision as this turning point in history, where he sort of sees an overlap of aesthetics, and perhaps for Yeats it's an aesthetic dominance of the West over the East,
Hmm.
but one that is quite useful for this imagined transmission of sculptural forms and norms, for Yeats at least.
Hmm. I love the imagery there, although it's really troubling, but it's also it's quite beautiful. Many-headed foam, and we can think of the immensity of the ocean and this kind of the sort of vastness, even the sublime, but also the a naval battle, thinking about people being, people dying in the foam, representing something awful, but also something in this manner that Yeats is so good at in this kind of beautiful way. Um, and also that putting off that the way he picks up then in the seventh line, putting off the foam. So we have the many-headed foam, and then putting off the foam, the battle casting somehow. And it's an interesting expression, to put off. It's just sort of whole. There is an element that it's part of this history, but it's also been resisted to some extent by this by Phidias, and Phidias then seems to represent a kind of higher order of sculpture than what we've gotten before, either the Pythagorean sort of ratios, or this kind of what he characterizes as kind of vague Asiatic form of sculpture. Um, what about the last line? And the common idea in Yeats about sculpture giving women in particular dreams, which sort of links back to the first stanza as well.
Yeah, I think this connects again to the boys and girls pale from the imagined love of solitary beds. This idea of an idealized form, in this case given by the sculptor Phidias, and that allows a kind of focus on the ideal beauty. Again, it's a slightly absurd notion, and it begins with that sentence that it wasn't the victory at the Battle of Salamis that put off the many-headed foam, but in fact it was those ideal Greek sculptures that precede the battle that in fact win it out. And again, this is this slightly idiosyncratic tendency that Yeats has at the time of the vision, and also at the time of poems like The Statues and The Long-Legged Fly, where he really is trying to map human history onto some version of art history or cultural history. And he's trying to trace through art objects some movement that can explain different civilizations. And obviously, in a vision, it can become quite absurdly geometrical and schematic in the way he tries to set it out. But here, he's trying to persuade through language, I think, through the poem, how that
Mhm.
movement happens on aesthetics more than it
At an
does
aesthetic level
runs.
rather than a historical level. That's right. And thanks for clarifying that, because I'd skipped over and not. So I was thinking about it in terms of the battle itself. But you're right, and not the banks of oars that swam by. So it was the aesthetic force rather than actual these historical events that were the main driver of this kind of this genealogy of sculpture. So yeah, that's really it's fascinating. It's a good example just of how Yeats is always thinking in these kind of broader, sort of spiritual and I don't know, these general sort of level, almost Hegelian, but not quite Hegelian sort of ways of history moving as opposed to these kind of material acts like the battle. Um, so in any case, one image crossed that the many-headed, sat under the tropic shade, grew round and slow. Um, so there's an image that we get from that crossed out of the East and has become part of the Western culture, right? And that image, I guess, is what the Buddha. Is that what we're getting here?
I think so, yeah. He's trying to draw a distinction between a thin Hamlet, or some sort of ascetic character, and one that's grown large and is hinting here visually at perhaps the sculptures of the Buddha.
Hmm.
Um, it's another bizarre moment where, again, it's hard to follow, and I think you're absolutely right. There's this compression of so many different ideas from a vision, but also I think some of the more difficult passages of On the Boiler, where he's thinking about eugenics and uh, also various ideas of how the ideal form is informed by art and is way led in different ways. I find this a particularly strange moment. I myself don't know exactly why Hamlet pops up here. I wonder if you've got an interpretation of it, but there's a few hints of Shakespeare in this stanza.
Yeah, I mean, there's a way in which Hamlet seems to represent a kind of Western uh, consumption of the self in thought, and I've always associated this with some of the earlier references to um, Maud Gunn. To some of the references to Maud Gunn took a mess of shadows for me. That those sort of lines and this kind of way in which there's a kind of growing thin um, by meditating on or ruminating on these kinds of abstractions and concerns. There's kind of I get a sense of kind of worry here, like Western worry that is that damages the physical self and that leads to this kind of thinness. Um, but there are you're right about all these, of course, these Shakespeare references, and I'm not sure. I don't even know where's the idea of Hamlet eating flies even come from. I don't even know what that's a reference to.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I think I fully buy your point as well here. But I think there's a character like a Hamlet who's caught up in his own thought versus some idea of Zen Buddhism that's coming through as this stanza progresses. I definitely agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I've sort of talked with students about that too. I mean, I find this stanza really difficult, but I've talked to them about ways relating to their own lives and kind of ways of being and how we interact with the world. And I said the sort of the one who is the worrying figure versus the more ascetic figure of the Buddha. But it also seems to be critical here of the Buddha as well, right? That's not uh, grew round and slow. I mean that's not an ideal vision of the Buddha either. It's sort of the fat, flabby Buddha we get in those kinds of sculptures.
Yeah, I think this still fits in some ways with Yeats's dim view or perhaps lack of awareness of Eastern sculpture and his own, I guess, tastes around sculpture. I think also that that first line about the one image crossed the many-headed sat, etc., connects in some ways to the draft versions of the poem, where in the first stanza in drafts it refers specifically to Apollo and the
Hmm.
statue of Apollo specifically, and there's an idea of reincarnation that kind of fits through the stanzas in the draft that no longer appears in the published version. But this idea that there's one figure that's reappearing as divine or semi-divine figures from stanza to stanza, and that goes from ancient Greek to seemingly here India in the Middle Ages to eventually Ireland.
Hmm.
Um, I think that idea of the one image that coheres and fits into statues and sculptural forms through these different periods is something that Yeats at least has in the background.
I was reading some criticism about this poem a couple of months ago, and I forget who it was, but they were talking about it might have been in Albright's, it might have been in Daniel Albright's notes, but it's sort of the idea of that each civilization creates God in its own image. So there's
Mm.
this one that's running through, and I think this is what you're sort of alluding to here, right? This it's manifesting itself in these various forms and takes the image from the people who are imagining and interacting in that civilization. So we have the kind of God manifesting itself then in that the thin figure of Hamlet, out of this kind of Western neuroses, or we get the fat, flabby Buddha out of this kind of, and again, stereotypical for Yeats, but about some imagined idea of an Eastern kind of consciousness that's where it sees the world as all mirror on mirror, the world as sort of this show and sort of pushing back and transcending that reality. So that, I think that makes sense. And I think, as you say, the one image, like that's really key. And I think I've tended to gloss over that as I've talked with students about this poem. But that makes sense to me in the drafts. I didn't know about the drafts with Apollo, but that seems to make sense then. This one running throughout and then manifesting it differently. Um, okay, so just a couple little questions if you have thoughts on these. Mirror on mirror, I think we get with this sort of Buddhist perspective. Um, what's up with the gong and conch? Any idea
Um,
what that's
well,
referencing?
I'll just say, but before that, even the empty eyeballs, I think,
Oh yeah.
connects to Yeats's admiration for Roman sculpture that replaces various uh, rare stones or uh, colored eyeballs with just empty eye sockets, and he admires this as some innovation in sculpture.
Mm,
I don't exactly know what he means by knowledge increases on reality, but I think again it's coming back to Zen Buddhism, and you mentioned mirror on mirror mirrored, this kind of tongue twister that we get. I think he's drawing partly some scholars I think attribute this to D.T. Suzuki, the Japanese philosopher and thinker on Zen Buddhism, who talks about how the human mind should be like a mirror free from stains, focused merely on reflection. So I think those ideas are coming together. And then Gong and Conch throws me off. I guess I always read the Gong in relation to Byzantium. And it's maybe playing again with Eastern and Western symbolism and some idea of a syncretism or a fusion between them.
hmm. I think, as you're talking, I think that the knowledge increases on reality is thinking about the way that the painted eye suggests a kind of paradigms for under abstract notions or paradigms for understanding the world, and that we see when we see with those kinds of eyes as opposed to empty eyeballs, we are not seeing reality itself, but we are slotting reality into preconceived notions, and thus that would be the increasing of unreality. I think that's what that suggests. I don't know. That was my thought as you're talking about it. And then we get Grimalkin, the cat. That's Macbeth. Another weird Shakespeare reference here. That's from Macbeth, I believe. I don't know if you have a thought of that one.
Yeah, I think that's the cat that helps the three witches tell Macbeth's future as well. So there's something still about foresight and seeing the next move in human civilization here going on. But again, I really struggle with this stanza just for the obscurity and the it may be a compression of different ideas that it has, but it also seems almost scattershot in the way it
It does, doesn't it?
accumulates them.
Yeah. Although for me, I think I really liked what you said earlier about recalling the mock heroic in the Atava Rima, and this is the first time I've ever read the poem and sort of had a bit of a bleak look at the high seriousness of the whole thing. There just seemed to be a bit of a comic element to all of it. This kind of scattershot, trying to do. I mean, part of it's the baseline absurdity of trying to compress all of this, an entire aesthetic history, and linking it with the move of civilization into these kind of four stanzas. And yeah, it changes the tone a little bit of the poem for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think there is some value to not taking it too seriously. And I know that as I read Yeats' Atavarimas, I think the rhetoric and the syntax, Pierre MacDonald talks about this really well in serious poetry. You know, it's a language that is taught and organized so perfectly, and the rhythm and the meter, even in parts of this, it comes into perfect iambic pentameter. You know, it does insist upon a kind of seriousness to the rhythm and the music of it, and yet at the same time, I do think uh, as you kind of spiral between these mirrors, reflecting mirrors or whatever, you can sort of have you can sort of take a wry look at it, and also I think maybe there's a bit of humor to it.
Hmm. Of course, the end is quite serious. The last stanza, we're dealing with serious stuff here, the reflection back on the 1916 Rising. So maybe take us through this last stanza.
Yeah, well, it's going back to Helen Vendler. I think she is right when she talks about particularly this last stanza, but about the poem itself. She says that it's Yeats's single most sustained use of agitation in a
Mhm.
Tavarima.
Mhm.
And whilst I still see hints of humor, I think there is a bitterness about modernity that we get in that final stanza. And again, if you're not teaching this to an Irish audience, I think the reference to the post office, maybe there's a bit of humor there, but it is also Yeats in the late 1930s, not long before his death, looking back at the consequences of the Easter Rising in 1916 and asking about the leader of the Easter Rising, Patrick Pearse, who helped seize the General Post Office. When Pearse summoned Cuchulainn to his side, what stalked through the post office? It seems to be going back to uh, sculpture again, and a sculpture of Cuchulainn that was executed by Oliver Shepherd, a sculptor that Yeats went to art school with. And he has perhaps also talked about the figure of Cuchulainn in Irish myth as this heroic figure that now gets connected perhaps to Pierce and this idea of martyrdom by the leaders of the Rising.
Mhm. I think the tone in some of the verbs there, to summon, there's a sort of high seriousness about that moment. And we also have that nice alliteration running throughout. Someone calling to his side what stalked through the post office to the idea of something has been, again, this kind of almost mythic religious significance, summoning something that then stalks and reminds us a little bit of rough beast kind of ideas here, and just this kind of immensity here in this moment, and what is the thing that has been summoned. And of course, that's what the next question. And as you're saying, I think these are all questions about that are bound up with his understanding of aesthetics and sculpture more specifically. So there's a kind of reprise of what we had before: intellect, calculation, numberment, measurement, and then to reply. Um, so what? How do you read those question, or that question there? Um, he seems to be asking a question within the terms of sculpture to understand some manifestation of this immensity of historical transformation.
Yeah, I think it's another one of those great unanswerable Yeats questions that he asks us. What intellect, what calculation, number, measurement replied. Obviously those words that repeat throughout the poem, number, measurement,
Mhm.
calculations that look but casual flesh, are all coming back again. And it seems as if it's an attempt to contextualize or explain what's happened with the Easter Rising and the aftermath of it. Um, and again, turning to the sculptural analogies.
Mhm.
So it seems specifically to be talking about the Cahalan statue that from 1935, I think, onwards, was installed in the post office as a memorial to the Easter Rising leaders.
Mhm.
But it also seems to be talking about the ideal forms there and maybe a different course that Ireland might chart. Maybe it's not about the specific sculpture, but a disappointment with that sculpture and what reply might be offered. And I guess if we read the next lines as an answer to that, it's one that is maybe Yeats once again reciting the Anglo-Irish sect as distinct from the rising leaders and the path that Ireland's gone on. We Irish born into that ancient sect. I always read sect as almost sectarian in the way Yeats is bringing it in. And maybe this is again what Roy Foster is talking about, that anti-democratic sense that we get in the late Yeats.
Hmm.
Um, and this disgust with modernity that perhaps connects to that many-headed foam at Salamis. We now have the filthy modern tide in Ireland, and by its formless spawning fury wrecked.
Hmm. I think that makes so much sense. I really like the way you framed it at the outset. We can think of this idea of something in 1916 happens. There's a summoning. And what is the reply to that summoning? And in one way, in one sense, we have a statue that Yeats didn't particularly like that's in the post office. We have this particular thing that was calculated number measurement. I mean, it's a sculpture. But then there's also this more abstract ideal, which is also in the terms of aesthetics, and it is a kind of idea in sculpture, but it's not this particular sculpture. It's something else, some other possible ideal, which then it seems to be trying to answer in the end. And as you point out, there's a sense of that there's the Anglo-Irish that maybe are attached to the, it's so strange, right? We Irish. So there's a generalizable Irish, born into that ancient sect, which I think you're right, suggests that sort of sectarianism and Anglo-Irish, and then all cast into this modernity, which recalls all of that fears about Indian democracy or whatever Yeats is thinking of with that formlessness in the backdrop coming from the East. Um, so there's a sort of heritage that's tied to the Anglo-Irish, and how can it be realized in an Ireland that's now part of this vast formless sort of modernity? Of course, the answer seems to be then, and of course, spawning fury has the eugenics element too. That that there's a kind of declension going on. That there's a lowering of the bloodlines, et cetera. The really troubling things we get in some of the late Yeats and on the boiler. But the answer seems to be to climb to our proper dark, and that's always been another difficult line for me to talk about. What's your sense of the notion of even the metaphor of it, to climb to a dark is really interesting. Like I usually think of descending into a darkness, but here we've got this idea of someone climbing up to a higher order of dark, and it's not just dark; it's a proper dark. It's the correct dark. But what is this? If you could, if you ever thought about what this dark means.
Yeah, to be honest, I've never thought about that verb climb, but it is it's an interesting one even for the image. Is this climbing upwards or downwards into the
Right, like
dark?
so where we climb, yeah, to climb downwards, to climb upwards. I always think of that line as saying now we descend. In fact, when I re recall the poem, I'll sometimes mistakenly say descend to our proper dark.
Mhm.
Um, but you're right, of course, it could be climbing downwards or upwards. There's something arduous about it, right? There's something active in difficult in having to climb to this space. Um, and in that space, somehow there's an answer in this space, but I'm not sure what the space is and what the answer is.
Yeah, again, it's sort of it's dark and obscure, I think, on purpose, but something about moving past the formlessness, the filthy modern tide, into more solid objects again. And I think that idea of tracing a plummet measured face is maybe hinting at the plumb bob, that you'd
Right.
use for drawing the anatomically exact symmetries of a face and sketching, but then also translating that into sculpture. The lineaments that pops up again, that's a favorite Yeats word.
Hmm.
But yeah, again, it seems to me to be kind of distinguishing between that the exclusivity of the we Irish seems to be a kind of elitism for Yeats, and indeed kind of eugenic in its distinction from the formless spawning fury. Uh, to this more measured, calculated, ideal form. I think a lot of those ideas around on the boiler are in there, but
Hmm.
also in a general introduction to my work, where He talks about his despair when he walks down O'Connell Street and across the River Liffey to see the electric lights that are shining in this kind of disgust with modernity that he finds at the end of his life. And maybe this is kind of a crotchety figure of Yeats, but here it's rendered in these quite stark and serious terms in the end of the poem.
Do you think the proper dark is a kind of is it something Irish? Is it a kind of racial if I could use the word a kind of racial consciousness, or is it something that is um, more basic that returns us to what the boys and girls seem to know that they already have this ideal that they grasp in their own proper dark as they're in their beds. Um, do you think it's something specifically Irish here? Or is it more generalizable, or maybe that's the wrong way to frame the question?
No, I think that's a great point. I didn't really think of it as the dark of their solitary beds, but it might be sort of that contemplative inwardness again that you're turning towards. It reminds me as well of To Ireland in the Coming Times, where he
Mhm.
talks about things discovered in the deep, and there's some hint of a darkness that they're going back to find the foundations.
Yeah, some return to this core, which then will, if we think about what you were talking about before, this sort of different God that the Apollo figure manifesting itself in all of these different forms, it seems to be a call back to something basic, something ordered, which will then spawn another manifestation. And if it has that vitality, that human side of it rather than just pure abstraction, it will take some different form, some other character, which would of course be different from the shepherd sculpture that we have. There'd be something else, some other kind of way of thinking about Ireland. But he definitely seems cranky and in despair. And of course the line, the filthy modern tide is, that's another famous sort of line and seems in despair of what will come in Ireland. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is something tantalizingly ambiguous about passages in that poem that I'm sure there's many other interpretations that we've missed today, but that every time I come back to it, I see something different in it or a different avenue that you could go down from
Yeah.
those lines.
Yeah, I think it's really, I think the way we've talked about it, that was really helpful for me in thinking about the poem. I've come back a couple of times, mentioned this, the mock heroic side of things is I think useful because when I talk with students, I get caught up in this high seriousness, and in some ways we turn the poem. I felt this way in my class sometimes. I turn the poem into a sort of philosophical meditation, but you lose something in that because of the strange particularity of the poem, all of the weird those weird references to Shakespeare and the strange juxtaposition of images and those moments of ambiguity that are really part of the power of the poem. It makes it different from what would be if this were just a philosophical treatise on the history of art would seem kind of cranky and strange and very, like real total generalizations and, all the kind of Yeats kookiness. But as a poem, it's so strange and moving. And I think returning it to that sort of a little bit, again, it's got high seriousness in it, but a little bit of that mock heroic element helps to take us down off from our stilts a little bit on it. And I also think the idea of the what you pointed out about the drafts is really useful. That idea of the Apollo figure and then those different manifestations helps to clarify a bit in the poem. Well, that was a lot of fun. Do you have any final things you want to say about it? Any last thoughts?
No, I just totally agree with your summary as well. I do think the unserious elements of Yeats and the humor can maybe make this a less imposing poem. And I think exactly as you said, though, at the same time, it's the rhetoric and the form that makes this so much more appealing than simply reading passages of a vision. The same as the Second Coming. There's something that's being distilled into the poetry that is there's a much vaster prose treatise on this material, and yet um, what is condensed and what is missing, but also what resonates through poetic form and simply the felicity of language that connects in different ways through a tavarima is what makes the poem, for me at least, much more magnetic, even whilst it's enigmatic.
Gosh, I'm gonna teach it again. I always do this every time I have these conversations. I'm like, it enlivens how I see these poems, and it opens up new ways of thinking about them with students, which is just great. It's the way that, constant renewal of our experiences of these poems, and why Yeats is so fantastic to come back to over and over again, because he is so complicated and so interesting. So, this was a real pleasure. I enjoyed that quite a bit. It was fun talking with you. Got new ideas for the statues. I hope a lot of people listening to this learned some things. So thanks loads, and I will see you hopefully at some point in the not too distant future.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rob.
All right, take care.